What if I told you that Africa had universities, thriving empires, and global trade networks long before Europe ever set foot on the continent? That the story of Africa you probably learned in school, the one that painted it as a dark continent, backward and waiting to be rescued, is not only misleading, but one of the biggest historical cover-ups of all time. See, most of us grew up with this image of Africa as a place of poverty, tribal wars, and chaos. Rarely do we hear about Africa's golden cities, about kings who commanded armies larger than some European nations, or about libraries that held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts while Europe was still crawling out of the Middle Ages. And yet, all of that was real. All of that was Africa, before colonization. In this video, I'm going to show you the Africa the textbooks skipped, the Africa you were never taught about. By the end, you'll see the continent in a way that will completely change how you think about history, and maybe even how you think about the world today. But let's make this more interesting. I'm not just going to dump facts on you. Instead, I want to pull you into three mysteries, three truths that almost no one talks about. First, why did Africa's golden cities, the ones that rivaled the great cities of Europe and Asia, disappear from our history books? Were they simply forgotten? Or was there a deliberate effort to erase them? Second, the shocking truth about African education before colonization. Spoiler alert, it didn't begin with Europeans building schools. Africa had its own centers of learning, some of which were so advanced that scholars traveled from across the world to study there. And third, the real reason colonization happened. Most people think it was just about land or bringing civilization. But the truth is far more dramatic and far more calculated than what we were told. Stick around, because once we pull back the curtain, you'll never see Africa or history the same way again. When you hear the phrase, Africa before colonization, what comes to mind? For most people, it's an image of scattered villages, people in huts, and endless wilderness. That stereotype, the one we've seen in old movies, history books, and even in classrooms, comes from a narrative that painted Africa as the Dark Continent, a place with no history, no civilization, and nothing worth remembering until Europeans discovered it. But let's smash that myth right now. Africa was never a blank space waiting to be written on. It was a continent alive with empires, kingdoms, and cities that could rival the world's greatest civilizations. Take Timbuktu, for example. Today the name is often used as a punchline, some faraway random place. But in the 1300s and 1400s, Timbuktu was one of the most important cities in the world. Imagine New York or London today, but in the 1300s, that's what Timbuktu felt like. It was a buzzing center of trade, wealth, and most importantly, knowledge. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on science, medicine, mathematics, law, and philosophy. Students came from as far as the Middle East and Europe to study there. Doesn't sound so primitive, does it? Or consider the Mali Empire, led by rulers like Mansa Musa, who is often called the richest man in history. His wealth wasn't measured in a few gold coins. It was so vast that when he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, he gave away so much gold along the way that it caused inflation in entire regions for years. Let that sink in. A single African king disrupted global economies with his generosity. Then there's Great Zimbabwe, with its massive stone structures, towers, and walls that still stand today. Built without modern machinery, these structures were architectural marvels. Travelers who saw them for the first time couldn't believe Africans had built them. Some even tried to credit outsiders because the idea that Africans had created such grandeur didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. And don't forget the Kingdom of Aksum, located in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. By the 4th century, Aksum was already a major power,
minting its own coins, trading with India and Rome, and adopting Christianity long before much of Europe. So when people say Africa was behind, you have to ask, behind what? Behind whom? Because the evidence shows Africa wasn't behind at all. It was leading in many ways. Now here's where the real question comes in. If all of this is true, why don't we hear these stories in school? Why is Timbuktu reduced to a joke? Why are the ruins of Great Zimbabwe almost never mentioned? And why is Mansa Musa left out of the list of history's greatest rulers? That's the new mystery we're about to uncover. The truth is, these stories weren't just forgotten. In many cases, they were deliberately erased or buried under a mountain of stereotypes to make room for a different narrative, a narrative that served someone else's agenda. So let's dig into that. Because the erasure of Africa's true history isn't just an accident of time. It's part of a bigger story that shaped how the world sees Africa even today.
When people talk about Africa before colonization, education is almost never part of the conversation. The story usually goes, Europeans came, built schools, and introduced learning. But that's a lie. The truth is, Africa had thriving systems of education long before European ships touched its shores. Let's go back to Timbuktu, because this city wasn't just a hub for trade. It was also home to one of the world's oldest universities, the University of Songhai. Picture this. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Songhai had thousands of students and teachers. They studied everything from astronomy and medicine to law and theology. Some estimates say Timbuktu housed up to 700,000 manuscripts. Yes, nearly 750,000 documents, covering subjects that ranged from mathematics to music. And here's the kicker. While Timbuktu was blossoming as a center of learning, much of Europe was still struggling through the aftershocks of the Middle Ages. To put it in perspective, when Oxford and Cambridge were just beginning to gain recognition, Songhai had already been thriving as an academic powerhouse. Imagine if in your mind you've always pictured Africa as behind, but then you find out African universities were attracting students while many Europeans couldn't even read their own names. It completely flips the script, doesn't it? But education in Africa wasn't only about universities. Knowledge was also preserved and passed down through oral traditions. Storytelling wasn't entertainment. It was a highly respected system of preserving history, law, ethics, and cultural values. Griots, who were like living libraries, carried the histories of families, kingdoms, and even entire empires in their memory. One griot could recite lineages going back centuries. This wasn't primitive, this was genius. Imagine having a human Google, someone who could pull up detailed history without a single written record. So let's compare. While European education at the time was heavily limited to the elite, mostly inside monasteries and later universities, African knowledge systems were both formal and communal. Yes, there were great universities, but there was also a culture of teaching through community life, through proverbs, songs, rituals, and oral history. Education wasn't just about academics. It was about shaping people for life and society. And that raises a bigger question. If Africa had such advanced knowledge systems, why isn't this common knowledge today? Why isn't Songhai as famous as Oxford or Harvard? Why do people still believe that Africans had no written history when evidence proves otherwise? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Africa didn't lose its knowledge systems overnight. They were buried, dismissed, or outright stolen. During colonization, manuscripts were taken or destroyed. Oral traditions were mocked as unreliable. And slowly, Africa's own narrative about itself was replaced by one written through someone else's pen. And this brings us to the next curiosity. How exactly did Africa lose control of its own story? Because the answer isn't simple. It wasn't just colonizers landing and taking notes. It was a calculated effort backed by politics, power, and propaganda to reshape the image of an entire continent. That's the story we're about to uncover next.
When you think about global trade before colonization,
Africa rarely gets mentioned. The story often skips straight from Europe to Asia, as if Africa was just a giant empty landmass waiting to be discovered. But here's the truth. Africa was not only part of global trade, it was central to it. Let's start with the basics. Gold and salt. These weren't just resources, they were the lifeblood of economies across continents. Gold from West Africa flowed into Europe and the Middle East, shaping entire economies. Salt, which we take for granted today, was so valuable it was literally worth its weight in gold. Imagine entire caravans stretching for miles across the Sahara, carrying slabs of salt and gold, connecting cities like Gao, Timbuktu, and Cairo. And it wasn't just gold and salt. Africa was also known for ironworking and ivory. African blacksmiths were producing high-quality iron tools and weapons long before many European nations could match that craftsmanship. Ivory from East Africa was exported to Asia and Europe, prized for its beauty and durability. Now, picture the cities that powered this trade. Cairo, with its bustling markets, was not only a hub for African trade, but a global one. On the East African coast, cities like Kilwa and Mombasa thrived as major trading ports. These weren't small villages, they were cosmopolitan cities where African, Arab, Persian, Indian, and even Chinese merchants met. Goods, ideas, and cultures blended here centuries before the modern idea of globalization. But if we're talking about African wealth and trade, we cannot ignore the most dramatic example. Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali. He wasn't just rich, he was so rich that historians today still struggle to calculate his fortune. Some call him the richest man who has ever lived. In 1324, Mansa Musa made a pilgrimage to Mecca. But this wasn't a simple religious journey, it was a spectacle that shook the world. He traveled with an entourage of tens of thousands, soldiers, attendants, and slaves, all carrying gold. Along the way, Musa gave away so much gold in places like Cairo that it caused inflation. Think about that for a moment. One man's generosity disrupted entire economies for over a decade. Imagine Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk casually walking into a country and accidentally crashing its financial system by spending too much money. That was Mansa Musa. And here's the wild part. When Europeans were first making maps of the world, some maps literally drew Mansa Musa sitting on a golden throne holding a golden nugget in his hand to represent the wealth of Africa. That's how legendary he was. So let's pause here and ask, if Africa had all this wealth, all this innovation, and such a central role in global trade, then why is the continent so often portrayed as poor, helpless, and underdeveloped? That's the new mystery we have to dig into, because Africa's riches didn't vanish into thin air. The continent's wealth, power, and innovation were deliberately redirected, exploited, and in many cases stolen. And understanding how that happened is the key to understanding why Africa looks the way it does today. So let's peel back the layers of the story and explore how Africa went from wealthy empires to the victim of one of the most aggressive colonization projects in history.
One of the most common myths about pre-colonial Africa is that it was chaotic, that tribes were constantly fighting, and that there were no real systems of governance. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Across the continent, there were well-developed political systems that balanced leadership with accountability. In many kingdoms, leaders didn't rule alone. They worked with councils of elders or advisory groups that represented the people's voices. For example, among the Ashanti in West Africa, the king, known as the Asante Hene, was powerful, but he couldn't make big decisions without the council's approval. In other words, there were checks and balances long before checks and balances became a buzzword in Western politics. Justice, too, was highly community-driven. Instead of punishment being the only goal, many African societies practiced restorative justice, the idea that wrongdoers should repair harm and restore balance to the community. In many cases, reconciliation mattered more than revenge. Imagine if our modern systems of justice worked not just to punish, but to heal. That was Africa's approach centuries ago. But governance wasn't the only mark of sophistication. Africa was bursting with art, music, and spirituality that shaped everyday life. Sculptors in Ife and Benin were creating bronze and terracotta works so detailed and lifelike that European explorers who first saw them couldn't believe Africans made them. They actually thought the art must have been created by some lost civilization from elsewhere. Think about that. The craftsmanship was so advanced, outsiders couldn't even accept the truth of its origin. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was history, communication, and spirituality wrapped together. Drums carried messages across villages, songs preserved genealogies and wisdom. And dance wasn't only for celebration, it was also ritual, storytelling, and sometimes even diplomacy. Spirituality in Africa was deeply connected to both the seen and the unseen. Many societies believed in a creator, but also in the interconnectedness of ancestors, nature, and humanity. This wasn't superstition, it was a worldview that shaped how people treated each other and the environment around them. And then there was science. From agricultural techniques that allowed farmers to work with the rhythm of the land, to advanced iron smelting in places like the Nok culture in Nigeria, Africans were innovating in ways the world rarely acknowledges. Even navigation and astronomy played huge roles in guiding trade across deserts and seas. So, here's the payoff. Africa was not a land of chaos before colonization. It had order, it had systems, it had complexity. In fact, it had many of the same things we value today: governance, justice, art, spirituality, and science. But now the big question comes in, the one that keeps people leaning forward. If Africa was this advanced, this organized, this rich in culture and leadership, then why did colonization succeed? How did foreign powers carve up an entire continent at the Berlin Conference and rewrite its destiny? Was it military superiority? Was it political trickery? Or was it something deeper, something hidden in the way narratives and power intersected? That's the next mystery we need to uncover, because understanding how colonization succeeded will finally reveal why Africa's golden story was interrupted and who benefited from that interruption.
So if Africa was wealthy, advanced, and organized, how on earth did colonization succeed? The answer might shock you, because it wasn't random. It wasn't just Europeans accidentally stumbling onto Africa and deciding to stay. The colonization of Africa was deliberately planned, like a corporate takeover, but on a continental scale. The big moment came in 1884, at what is now known as the Berlin Conference. Imagine this: European powers gathered in Berlin, Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, and others, sitting around a table with maps of Africa spread out in front of them. Not a single African leader was invited, not one. And yet in just a few months, they carved up an entire continent as if it were a cake at a birthday party. They drew straight lines on maps, slicing through kingdoms, communities, and cultures that had existed for centuries. People who once spoke the same language, traded in the same markets, and prayed in the same temples, suddenly found themselves citizens of different colonies. Others were forced together with rival groups under artificial borders that would later fuel conflicts. Now, the official story was that they were bringing civilization and Christianity to Africa. But let's be real, that was the sales pitch. The hidden motive was far more brutal: resources and power. Africa's gold, diamonds, rubber, ivory, and fertile lands were irresistible to European economies that were hungry for raw materials to fuel their growing industries. And here's something rarely talked about. Europeans weren't just chasing resources, they were also terrified of Africa's potential. Remember, by this point, they knew about Mansa Musa, about Timbuktu's libraries, about Africa's kingdoms and trade networks. They saw a continent that could compete, that could rise as a global powerhouse. Colonization wasn't just about stealing, it was about pressing pause on Africa's story. Think of it this way: Africa's history was like a Netflix series filled with drama,
triumph and progress. And just when the story was getting to its best episodes, the golden empires, the flourishing cities, colonization came along and hit pause. Except this wasn't a short pause. It lasted decades, even centuries. And when the play button was finally pressed again, Africa's story had been rewritten by someone else. The damage went beyond economics. Colonizers didn't just take resources. They reprogrammed narratives. They spread the myth that Africa had no history worth telling, that Africans had no systems of governance, that the continent was destined to be civilized by outsiders. This wasn't accidental. It was propaganda, carefully designed to justify exploitation. And here's where we open our next loop. If colonization hit pause on Africa's golden story, then how has that pause and the rewriting of Africa's image continued to shape the way the world sees Africa today? Because think about it, the stereotypes we still hear, Africa is poor, Africa is dangerous, Africa has no history, those didn't appear out of thin air. They were seeded during this era. They were planted in textbooks, media, and culture, and some of them are still alive and well today. So let's dig into that next. Let's look at how the erasure of Africa's true history wasn't just something of the past, but something that continues to influence how the world views Africa and even how Africans view themselves.
Here's the part that flips the story on its head. Colonization wasn't about rescuing Africa, it was about robbing Africa. Robbing its gold, its diamonds, its fertile lands, its people, and perhaps most damaging of all, its story. Because think about it, what's the easiest way to control someone? It's not just by chaining their body, it's by chaining their mind. Colonizers didn't just take Africa's wealth, they rewrote Africa's identity. Textbooks in Europe and later across the world painted Africa as primitive, tribal, and backward. The achievements of empires like Mali, Songhai, and Axum were downplayed or ignored. The great libraries of Timbuktu? Barely a footnote. The art of Benin? Often mislabeled as the work of outsiders. And the systems of governance and justice? Cast aside as chaos, while European systems were glorified as the only path to civilization. And so, stereotypes were born. Stereotypes that still shape how the world sees Africa today. The idea of Africa as poor, the image of Africa as violent, the narrative of Africa as a place without history. These weren't coincidences. They were carefully crafted stories repeated until they felt like truth. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite all that, Africa never stopped creating, innovating, and influencing the world. Even under colonization, Africans resisted. They preserved culture through music, art, storytelling, and faith. They adapted, rebuilt, and rose again and again. Fast forward to today, and you'll see Africa's fingerprints everywhere. African music has gone global. Afrobeats, reggae, and gospel rhythms shape playlists worldwide. African scientists and entrepreneurs are building technologies that solve local problems and inspire global solutions. African fashion, film, and art are not just surviving, they're thriving on international stages. And here's a piece of truth rarely spoken. The resilience of Africa is one of the greatest untold stories in human history. Despite centuries of being stripped, misrepresented, and underestimated, the continent continues to produce leaders, innovators, and dreamers who shape the world. But that leads us to the final curiosity, the one question that lingers after everything we've uncovered. What if Africa had written its own history? Imagine if the libraries of Timbuktu had been preserved in their entirety. Imagine if African voices had told the story of the empires, the kings, the queens, the scientists, the philosophers, instead of outsiders doing it for them.
imagine how different the world's perception of Africa would be today. Would we still use words like developing world? Would Africa still be described in headlines with words like crisis and poverty? Or would it be recognized for what it has always been, a cradle of innovation, resilience, and power? That's the question I want to leave hanging for now, because it doesn't just challenge how we see Africa, it challenges how we see history itself.
We've traveled through Africa's hidden past, its great cities, vibrant trade networks, sophisticated systems of education, governance, and culture. And one truth stands tall above it all. Africa was never a blank slate waiting to be discovered. It was already writing its own story, building its own empires, and shaping the world long before colonization pressed pause on its progress. Remember the myths we broke? The so-called Dark Continent was home to golden cities like Timbuktu in Great Zimbabwe, centers of learning that rivaled Europe's finest institutions. Its wealth was legendary, with rulers like Mansa Musa shocking the world with riches so vast they shifted economies. Its systems of governance were rooted in balance, justice, and community, a far cry from the image of chaos that colonial narratives imposed. So here's the biggest lie of all. Not that Africa was conquered, but that Africa was nothing before it was conquered. That falsehood has shaped textbooks, media, and even global self-perception for generations. But the truth is clear. Africa was already something powerful, innovative, and deeply human. And the question that lingers is this: what if Africa had been allowed to continue writing its own story without interruption? What if its golden age wasn't buried under centuries of colonial propaganda? What would the world look like today if Africa's voice had never been silenced? This is why it matters, because history isn't just about the past. It shapes how we see ourselves and how the world sees us today. And reclaiming this truth is not just about pride, it's about power. So here's your call to action. If you believe more people should know this truth, share this video. Leave a comment. Start conversations. Teach your children, your friends, and even your teachers. Because the story of Africa is not just African history, it's world history. And it's time the world remembered.